Welcome to another F1 Fantasy team selection video. I'm going to be talking about the changes I've made already to one of my teams. I'll be talking about that very soon. But before we get into that, let's talk about my Race Week 9 performance in Canada and the best build specifically for Silverstone. So let's get straight into this. On screen you can see my third team, and it was frankly abysmal this week. Only 60 points scored, and it's way off the pace in terms of comparing it to the top two teams I have. And all of my drivers, bar Alonso, failed to finish inside the top 10. Obviously, having Red Bull was a bit of a kind of comfort blanket, you could say, because Verstappen won the race and Red Bull ended up finishing with 31 points. But Ferrari and Mercedes were the top two performing constructors in Canada. So, as you can see, this was a complete disaster. Turbo driving Vettel, who, to be fair, in the race didn't do too badly. He ended up finishing 12th. But the problem with Vettel is that he showed such pace in the Friday practice sessions and also on Saturday FP3, but then suddenly things just went really wrong and the conditions maybe didn't favour him in qualifying, and he ended up 17th in qualifying. And we all expected him to be challenging in the top 10 for sure, and maybe in an even higher position. So that was a huge disappointment. I always say this, my third team is more experimental, but still I would like it to do a little bit better. But as you can see, on the whole, maybe it isn't the best looking team, and there is a reason why it finished with 60 points. It was a bit of a low scoring week in general, but let's move on to my top two teams. And finally, my first team outperformed my second one. Now, it wasn't anything spectacular, but 95 points isn't too bad, all things considered. So Alonso obviously had that penalty given retrospectively after the race. I believe he went from 7th to 9th. It was a bit of a disaster for him, and I don't even know how he got that Alpine into second place. It just shows his quality, one of the best drivers of all time. But I did turbo drive Sergio Perez. Now, I think I made a mistake here because the actual plan was to turbo drive Alonso in either Team 1 or 2, but maybe that was a bit of a mishap there in what I ended up doing. But ultimately, Perez was a huge disappointment, and maybe isn't the best driver in terms of the tricky wet conditions, and maybe it would have been a better option to turbo drive Alonso or Carlos Sainz. But as you can see, Alonso himself only scored 7 points, and with these DNFs, you never know what could happen. I still thought that Perez in the race, in the dry conditions, could move up into the top 5, and it was possible, especially with all the safety cars, but unfortunately he was one of the drivers with reliability issues once again. And then Carlos Sainz, 42 points, a mega performance by him, finishing in second place and qualifying in third. So really solid stuff, and he stepped up with Leclerc all the way at the back of the grid with the power unit penalties and all of that jazz. So Carlos Sainz, maybe in retrospect, was the one to turbo drive this week. Remember, you cannot put the captaincy or the turbo driver on someone who costs more than 20 million, unfortunately, and we're going to be going into that more so heading into Silverstone, because Russell has 2 streaks coming up, the qualifying and also the race streaks there. Gasly with 11 points, he finished in 14th. He's been very underwhelming. I thought he'd do much better, to be honest, and he definitely has the ability, but that AlphaTauri is very inconsistent, to be fair. And then Valtteri Bottas, kind of maybe the polar opposite, as consistent as ever, finishing in 7th. A really good performance there from Alfa Romeo. And Red Bull, once again, it's pretty much featuring in all of my teams. But what I'm looking to do now heading into Silverstone is to differentiate the squads a little bit by having Ferrari as the constructor in one of those 3 teams. I think that Ferrari could do very well in Silverstone. Mercedes is another one, but I just don't think they're worth the extra money. And if you're prepared to spend that much on a constructor, just go for Red Bull. There's no point in actually going for Mercedes, in my opinion. Although they are making some significant strides. They obviously finished in 3rd and 4th, and Russell is one of the best F1 fantasy assets in the game. Now let me show you my first team, how it did in Canada, before moving on to my transfer plans and also the transfers I've already made. I only scored 4 more points with my first team than the second one. So 99 points, one shy of the triple digits, the famous 100, and a very similar team overall. The main differences between teams 1 and 2 are having Vettel and Ocon in there. And ultimately, it was still a very underwhelming week in general. The turbo driver obviously kicked me really badly. If I had turbo drive Carlos Sainz, for example, that is a massive swing there of 40-50 points. So I did miss out a little bit in terms of the turbo driver. Congratulations to any of you who did have a very successful one. And my overall rank went from around 15,000 in the world to 27,000. So despite being quite happy with where I am at the moment, obviously there are a few things that I could have improved on to maintain the rank I was at and possibly push on, but definitely some things that we've learned over the first 9 race weeks of the season. We're heading into race week 10 in Silverstone. It should be a very interesting battle. We have a good idea of the best fantasy assets and the best constructors. I'll be going more into this when discussing the best builds as we go through each of my teams and my transfer plans and what I personally think are the 2 best builds, and they are going to be affordable for most people, and I'll talk about some alternatives just in case you don't have the funds funds in order to get these teams and players, drivers, whatever you want to call them, as well as the constructors that I'm going to be recommending in a second. Here are all three of my teams side by side, and let me know what you think of all of these. Which changes would you make and how are your teams looking like at the moment? Really the main plan, and I'll be discussing this as we go through each team and the transfer plans, is to have Ferrari in either Team 1 or Team 2, and that will play a huge part in the distribution of funds across all 5 drivers. So let's get straight into Team 3 and then build across to Team 2 and Team 1, just as we did with the race performance in Race Week 9. I've already made the following changes to my third team, so let me know what you think of these. So Gasly, Norris and Vettel have become George Russell, Bottas and Nicholas Latifi, but I still keep Perez and I still keep Red Bull. But as you can see, it's very difficult to fit in Russell, Perez and then a Ferrari driver like Leclerc or Carlos Sainz. That is the big issue. However, with one of the teams I'm going to be showing you very soon, you are able to do that, but you have to make a sacrifice somewhere down the road. So yeah, I want to see your opinions on which one is better. This kind of build that you've got here for Silverstone, or maybe the other one that I'm going to show you. So very interesting stuff. I don't think that there's much between them, and it's something I'm going to be debating throughout the rest of the week until we reach the practice sessions, and then I'll make a final informed decision there with teams 1 and 2. But as you can see, Team 3 is fairly set. Remember, you can't captain or turbo drive Russell because he costs over 20 million. So really my options are Bottas, Alonso, Latifi and Perez. And I think Perez is the clear winner here. So I've already made the 3 transfers. I don't really want to use extra ones and incurring minus 10 hits. So I think I'm going to keep things as they are for Team 3. It looks pretty good. I could even use the Mega Driver potentially on George Russell. And by the way, the price change is once again very crazy. Williams, for example, have gone up by 0.7 million, and by the time this video is released, it probably would have gone up yet again, so by 0.8 million. Imagine that, a difference, over a week or so, Williams going up by that much, and it just shows you the kind of external influences, we can call them, in the transfer market. But let's show you teams 2 and 1, the bread and butter of F1 Fantasy. I'm currently leaning towards something like this, with Ferrari as the constructor and having these 5 drivers. It looks very balanced. Yes, Latifi doesn't look great. I know a lot of people don't rate him as a driver, but he's actually quite a decent F1 Fantasy asset, one of the cheapest one available. Only Magnussen is cheaper, and he offers consistency through sheer reliability, and he can gain some places through other drivers DNFing. So that is definitely one possibility. If you're not too sure about Latifi and you have the funds, for example, then I'd go for Bottas, of course, or maybe go for Alex Albon or a few others around that price. Lance Stroll could be another one. But ultimately, if you're being quite realistic with your budget, this is what you'd go for. I actually can't afford this, not even with my main team. But what I could do in Team 1, if I wanted to go for something like this, is go for Carlos Sainz instead of Charles Leclerc, and I'd be able to afford it easy peasy with Team 1. Not so much with Team 2, my squad value is even worse here, so I have to make another compromise, and it could be Alonso making way for Valtteri Bottas instead. And honestly, Bottas has been by far the better option in F1 Fantasy this season, so it actually isn't too bad on paper. So in order to afford this for Team 2, having this build, I think I would go for Bottas instead of Alonso, which might not be ideal with the race streak, but then again, you look at the consistency and the results throughout the season, and it's not really the worst decision to make in the world, and the rest of the team looks extremely solid. So this is one of the builds that I've been talking about, the best build for Silverstone. Team 3 also is really good, but Team 1 might just offer you the very best build for Silverstone, and I just think it could go off in terms of consistency, the drivers, the constructor, it all works well, and I think it's just the best one available. Red Bull have been by far the best constructor in F1 Fantasy. Despite how good Ferrari are, I still think it's worth the extra funds and money to go for Red Bull. George Russell with both of those flames, his consistency, Mercedes' reliability. I think there are so many boxes to be ticked. The home race there for George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. So I think I would go for the Mercedes driver finally. It's really difficult to fit him in for the long term because he's so expensive, you can't turbo drive him, and ultimately you can go for Sergio Perez, Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc, and they offer you really good value for money and a possible way of also having Red Bull as your constructor. But for this race, with those potential extra 15 points, so long as he doesn't DNF and he can secure another top 5 finish, George Russell for me is right up there this weekend. So Valtteri Bottas, we all know about him. He is the best option under 10 million. He is approaching that price very soon. He's 9.6. Latifi is one of the better ones at that cheap price, around 6 million. If it wasn't for Haas being so unreliable, I think Magnussen and Mick Schumacher, especially in the case of Magnussen, would be fantastic choices. But unfortunately, Haas are so unreliable. Magnussen's getting a lot of minus points as a result. So I think I would go for a Williams driver like Latifi. Alonso has that streak coming up, but as I said earlier, Ocon is my overall preference. But I think either one of them, you can't really go wrong. And really, what I would recommend is go for a build like this, but wait for the practice sessions, and depending on Leclerc, Perez and Sainz, how they do, that's where you can make an informed decision and pick one of them. Because if Red Bull are dominating from the get-go, you could just go for Sergio Perez instead of Leclerc, and also it's more affordable that way. And then Carlos Sainz might be your way into that Ferrari team. If you can't afford Leclerc, then just go for Sainz, and I think that should be quite simple for you. So those are the kind of best builds in my opinion for Silverstone, from teams 3 all the way to team 1, with this one for me being my absolute favourite, and that's why I think I'm going to go for something like this heading into Friday and Saturday when the deadline locks in. So be sure to get your kind of choices in order, try to have a plan, and then look at the practice sessions. Then you can make that informed decision before qualifying begins. But thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, smash the like button and subscribe if you're new. Let's get this video to 100 likes. It'd be much appreciated. It really helps out the channel. And thank you very much to everyone who's been watching the first draft for FPL. If you haven't already, check that out. I uploaded it recently, and you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram, DylanRCM, as well as becoming a Patreon or channel member. It's all much appreciated. Thank you very much to all the channel members and patrons already. We've got a new one recently, Keith, so a big shout out to you. Thank you very much. I hope you continue to enjoy the summer break and the racing as always. It should be a great season, and I'll see you next time.